Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on a true earthquake of a book that didn't just critique philosophy. It set a bomb under the entire foundation of Western metaphysics and morality.
It really did.
We are diving into Friedrich Nietzsche's Jenseits von Gut und Böse.
Which translates, of course, to Beyond Good and Evil.
Right.
And we have to start with its full title because it's really the mission statement for the whole thing. Vorspiel einer Philosophie der Zukunft.
A prelude to a philosophy of the future.
Exactly. So this isn't just a commentary. It's a declaration of war on old ways of thinking and a pretty radical call for a new species of thinker.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're moving beyond those, comfortable, predictable systems of ethics and truth that Nietzsche just found utterly suffocating.
Yeah.
Our sources make it clear that the goal here is, well, it's nothing less than radical surgery on the twin concepts of truth and goodness. If you, the listener, feel like you have a stable sense of universal morality, I'd say, prepare for it to be utterly dismantled.
That's a good way to put it. Our mission today is to follow Nietzsche's sharp, often witty, and frequently aggressive critique of traditional Western culture. We're looking at his demand for a new, powerful breed of thinkers.
The Philosophen des Gefährlichen vielleicht.
The philosophers of the dangerous, perhaps?
I find that phrase, dangerous perhaps, just profoundly unsettling.
It is.
It throws you off balance because it implies that the truth we're all seeking might not be comforting.
Yeah.
It might not even be good for us. It might be actively harmful.
Right. And that's the core tension we're tackling today. This painful transition from the old dogmatic way of thinking, which Nietzsche says is built on, simple folk superstitions.
To a new philosophy, one rooted entirely in ruthless intellectual experimentation and this raw, non-moral force he calls the will to power.
So let's start right at the beginning with that opening salvo, the absolute assault on the entire history of dogmatic thought.
He opens his preface, the Verrede, with this famous, almost scandalous metaphor about the nature of truth.
He does.
He suggests, provided that truth is a woman Wahrheit ein Weib, then isn't it the case that all philosophers as dogmatists have just fundamentally misunderstood her?
It's a shocking image, but the point he's making is devastatingly serious. It's aimed squarely at the entire philosophical establishment.
So their methods were all wrong.
Completely. He argues that the way philosophers approached her, that dreadful earnestness, the schauerlich Ernst, and that awkward intrusiveness, the linkische Zudringlichkeit.
It was clumsy.
It was clumsy, improper, and at the end of the day, just pathetic. They treated truth like some stern, moral absolute that you could corner and force to comply.
And the result?
She has simply and repeatedly refused to let herself be won over. The implication is that every form of dogmatism, from Plato all the way down, is just standing there, sad and discouraged, having completely failed.
And he goes even further than that. He says everything dogmatic in philosophy, no matter how solemn or final it seemed,
must now be seen as nothing more than an edel Kinderei und Anfängerei.
a noble childishness and beginner's work.
Exactly. It's a total intellectual humiliation for 2 millennia of Western thought. He's basically reducing these massive systems like Kant and Hegel to, advanced kindergarten projects.
Which raises a really crucial question. If these magnificent, high-minded philosophical structures weren't built on logic, what were they built on?
According to Nietzsche, simple folk superstitions of immemorial time.
And what's the most foundational of these superstitions? The one that holds everything else up?
It's the enduring belief in the soul superstition, the Seal and Globe.
The soul.
Yes, this idea that there's a fixed, unitary, indivisible, and indestructible I or soul behind every thought, something separate from the body and from the flow of experience. It's the subject and ego superstition that still persists today.
Okay, so why is that belief in a fixed soul so fatal for philosophy?
Because that one simple, unexamined premise, the belief in a stable, metaphysical thing inside you, is the cornerstone for everything else. If you can assume a fixed, eternal soul, well, then it's a short step to assuming fixed, eternal, universal laws of morality and fixed, eternal, pure ideals of truth.
So the dogmatists only thought they could build these absolute systems because they started with the initial error of a stable I to begin with.
That's his point. It shows just how shaky the foundations really were.
This psychological critique, it leads us right to what he calls the great dogmatic error.
It does.
He doesn't just dismiss his predecessors. He says that all great things, if they're going to inscribe themselves on the heart of mankind with eternal demands, they first have to wander the earth as a monstrous and fear-inspiring grimace. Ungeheuer und furchteinflößende Fratzen.
And that grimace was dogmatic philosophy. He points to the Vedanta doctrine in Asia and, much more importantly for him, Platonism in Europe as the prime examples of this
Yeah.
vast, fear-inspiring imposition.
But he saves his most damning judgment for Plato.
Absolutely for Plato.
It's just breathtaking in its arrogance. The source labels Plato's invention of the pure spirit and the good in itself as the worst, most long-lasting, and most dangerous of all errors.
Schlimmste, langwierigste und gefährlichste aller Irrtümer.
Yes. Why Plato, specifically? What makes him the worst?
Because he's the one who introduced this radical separation of the sensible, dynamic, changing world, the world we actually live in, from some perfect, static, spiritual world of forms.
So by creating the pure spirit and the good in itself, he basically devalued this world.
He devalued the earth, the body, the instincts. He set up the entire metaphysical scaffolding for all the dualistic morality and metaphysics that came after.
And that's why the fight against Platonism is, for him, the same as the fight against centuries of Christian ecclesiastical pressure.
Precisely. For Nietzsche, Christianity is Platonism for the people. It's as simple as that. It took Plato's abstract dualism, spirit versus body, good versus evil, and it made it accessible, it moralized it, and it made it dominant. So overcoming Plato is the same thing as overcoming the spiritual nightmare that has plagued Europe for 20 centuries.
So if the dogmatists failed miserably and they built their castles on the sand of this soul superstition, what comes next?
Well, this is where he introduces the new philosophical mandate, the necessity of waiting for a new species of philosopher to arrive.
One who has a reversed taste and inclination compared to all their predecessors.
Yes, the long wait for the arrival of those Philosophen des Gefährlichen vielleicht.
The philosophers of the dangerous, perhaps.
These new philosophers, they have to possess a spirit that's capable of great tension. He uses this metaphor of a highly taught bow, one that's capable of shooting toward the most distant, non-immediate, and possibly terrifying goals.
And he thinks modern Europeans have lost that tension.
Completely. He says the modern European man feels this tension, this need for metaphysical struggle, as a genuine hardship, a nothstand. Our entire era is defined by attempts to relax that bow.
How so?
Through all sorts of means. The historical relaxation through the compromises of Jesuitism or, more recently, more perniciously, through the spread of democratic enlightenment.
And the relentless consumption of easily digestible news.
Exactly. All these things strive to make the spirit feel less like a hardship, less like a dangerous weapon, and more like a comfortable tool.
But the true free spirits, the good Europeans, they're the ones who still have that tension. They have the full stretch of the bow.
They're the ones who are poised for the new task, handling dangerous, maybe even contradictory truths that challenge our modern desire for comfort and ease. They are the thinkers who refuse to be mere levelers or democratic slaves.
That really sets the psychological stage for the next part of this. Peeling back the curtain to reveal the human, maybe all too human, elements that are driving this search for truth.
Yes, this is where Nietzsche becomes the ultimate advocate of suspicion, especially when it comes to the role of consciousness.
Which challenges the entire Western tradition, really, starting with Descartes. The idea that conscious, rational thought is the purest, most reliable way to discover things.
Right, and Nietzsche just flips that on its head. He suggests that conscious thinking, even in philosophy, is largely just instinctive activity.
And even more radically, that consciousness is set against the instinctive drives. Dem instinktiven Gegengesetz.
Exactly. Consciousness, for him, isn't the commander of our drives. It's often just the superficial part, the communicating part of our inner world. It's useful for survival, for herd communication, but not for getting at the deepest truths.
So the real philosophical work is being done where?
By instinct, by our drives, beneath the surface.
Okay, let's unpack the consequence of that claim. If philosophers think they're being purely rational, but they're actually being driven by these deep, secret, hidden instincts, what are they really doing when they write their masterworks?
They're acting as advocates. Section 5 gives us this devastating critique. Philosophers are simply advocates, advocate in defending their own secretly abstracted prejudices and heart's desires.
And then they clean them up, dress them in rational clothes, and call them truths.
That's it. He says they lack the courage of conscience, the Tapferkeit des Gewissens, to just admit that their grand metaphysics is really just a defense of their personal morality.
Which makes perfect sense if you think about how any human being works. I mean, if you spend your whole life building a complex system, a towering achievement of the mind, of course you're going to defend it.
You elevate your own fundamental pre-existing desires for order, for stability, for justice, whatever it is, to the level of a universal necessary law.
And this realization leads directly to the central argument of Section 6, a concept that is just fundamental to understanding his psychological approach.
Yes, that every great philosophy that has existed so far has been the involuntary and unconscious memoir, ungewollte und unvermerkte memoirs of its creator.
It's a self-confession,
Uh,
a personal history.
It is. So the seemingly most remote metaphysical claims of a philosopher, Spinoza's geometric precision or Kant's rigid categories, what they really are is a profound, if unintended, testimony to their moral or non-moral intentions.
It reflects the deep life germ from which the entire philosophical plant grows.
It reveals the man, not just the mind. If you want to understand any philosopher, don't just read their arguments on epistemology. Look at their life, their temperament, their deepest hopes, and ask, what morality drove them to invent their concept of the universe?
He says you do well to explain how a philosopher arrives at their most distant metaphysical claim by first asking, what morality does it will?
Exactly.
But wait, if this is true, if all philosophy is just an unconscious memoir, an advocate defending personal drives, then how do we treat beyond good and evil?
Yes.
Is this book just Nietzsche's own involuntary memoir too? What makes his will-to-power interpretation any more valid than Plato's pure spirit?
And that is the essential self-reflexive challenge that Nietzsche absolutely welcomes. He would argue that his philosophy is more honest precisely because it admits this condition.
So it's not about being universally true.
No, the value isn't in claiming universal truth, but in the level of strength and clarity that's displayed by the will that created it. His philosophy isn't valuable because it's right. It's valuable because it's a stronger, more honest, and more self-aware assertion of will than the ones that came before.
That distinction, strength of assertion versus objective truth, that brings us to the most radical concept in the entire book,
The will to power, the Willensmacht.
which he presents as the ultimate interpretive framework for everything.
Everything. It's his attempt to interpret the entire world, every event, every motion, as nothing other than a manifestation of this single, relentless, absolute will. It's a cosmological principle that replaces God, natural law, and teleology all at once.
So it's not just human ambition, it's the fundamental stuff of the universe.
It's the driving force behind everything. He suggests the world might be necessary and calculable, not because there are eternal fixed laws ruling it, but because the absolute will to power dictates its course relentlessly.
So the world is a closed system, but only because it's this constant, singular, unrelenting assertion of power claims.
Without beginning or end. And this assertion is so devoid of human sentiment that he says even the word tyranny would seem too weak, too human, too mild and mitigating to describe the sheer, terrifying force of it.
A sightless, relentless assertion of power claims upon power claims.
Which forces us, the free spirits, to consider that the drives we've previously denounced as bad, like hatred, envy, avarice, ambition, must be fundamentally present in the overall economy of life.
And maybe these bad drives must even be increased and intensified if life itself is to be increased and intensified.
Yeah.
That is a profoundly uncomfortable perspective. It induces what Nietzsche elsewhere calls nausea, especially for anyone who holds to a conventional humanitarian morality. It's a vision that just rejects comfort.
And that discomfort, that nausea, is precisely what the new philosopher must be able to withstand. He has to be willing to entertain dangerous knowledge, even if it's harmful to our simple human desire for rest or comfort or moral certainty. The power of the philosopher is measured by his capacity to look into that abyss and affirm it.
Okay, so with the philosopher exposed as an advocate for his own will, and the world defined by this relentless will to power, now we have to apply that same ruthless psychological lens to morality itself.
Right, viewing it as a natural, evolving history. Section 32 outlines this definitive shift in how human actions have been valued over time.
It's a powerful, concise taxonomy of human moral judgment, broken down into 3 long historical ages.
It is.
First, the longest era, the pre-moral period. This is where actions were judged exclusively by their consequences. They're Fulgen.
So if the result was good for the tribe, the action was good. It didn't matter if the person had pure thoughts or not.
And then came this momentous, fateful shift, the moral period.
Which is our period, the era of Christianity, Kant, modern humanitarianism. And here, actions are judged by their origin or their intention, the Absicht.
And Nietzsche calls this a fateful new superstition. and a peculiar narrowness of interpretation.
He does.
Why is valuing intention over outcome a superstition?
Because it places all the moral weight on the most ephemeral, subjective, and hidden part of an action, the feeling or thought behind it, instead of the concrete reality of its effect in the world.
So it's a metaphysical abstraction.
It is. It allows moralists to judge someone as good even if their actions are a total disaster, just because they meant well.
And the future. What's the third stage?
The immoralist period. This is the necessary next reversal. Here, the unconscious, unintentional nature of an action becomes its decisive worth. Morality has to move past this obsession with the inner world.
And he compares this shift to overcoming old pseudosciences.
Like moving past astrology and alchemy, the morality of intention is just a temporary phase. It's something to be overcome and eventually laughed at. The true worth of an action lies not in the conscious intent, the advocate's defense, but in the profound unconscious drives and instincts it reveals.
Which are, of course, manifestations of the will to power.
Of course.
But wait, if we move beyond intention, aren't we just going back to the pre-moral period of judging by consequences? How is the immoralist period different from the first one?
That's a critical difference. The pre-moral era judged actions based on their tangible consequences for the community. The immoralist era judges the quality of the action based on the inherent strength and type of the will that produced it, regardless of the conscious outcome.
So the emphasis is on the inner necessity and overflowing power, not the utilitarian effect.
Exactly. And that difference becomes razor-sharp when he takes aim at the concept of altruism or self-sacrifice, the Selbstentäußerungsmoral.
He's profoundly suspicious of devotion to self-sacrifice, isn't he? He sees them as moral mirages.
He demands that such feelings be brought to trial without mercy. He warns that this feeling of, for others, not for me, nicht für mich, is full of magic and sugar, Zauber und Zucker.
An intoxicating sweetness.
Yes, and it should invite double mistrust. He asks, are these acts of devotion just verführung and seductions? Maybe aimed at the self or maybe aimed at controlling other people?
And the ultimate psychological takedown of this is in section 221.
It is. He says that anyone who truly sacrifices knows they wanted and received something profound in return. They gave something up in order to have more there, maybe to feel more being or just more power over themselves or others, or even just to feel the intoxicating pleasure of pity.
So an action that comes from love or self-sacrifice is never unegoistic, as the moralists would define it.
Never. It's deeply interesting, it's complex, and it is profoundly egoistic because it fulfills a powerful, often hidden drive within the individual. The whole idea of pure selflessness is an illusion.
An illusion created by people who either don't understand the complex mechanics of their own soul,
or who are afraid to admit their own powerful inner drives.
This kind of psychological honesty leads directly to this hard-hitting connection between truth, danger, and health.
Right. If philosophical integrity means anything, the philosopher has to be able to withstand the possibility of a genuinely dangerous truth.
And in section 154, he equates skepticism with vitality.
He does. Objections, deviation, cheerful mistrust, the pleasure and mockery, these are all signs of health.
While everything unconditional is unbedingt, every dogmatic certainty, every moral absolute
belongs in pathology. A healthy mind is dynamic, skeptical, multifaceted.
That is so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
We're conditioned to believe that truth has to be beneficial, that it has to lead to happiness.
And yet, Section 34 declares that something may be true even if it were highly harmful and dangerous to life. The philosopher of the future must accept this potential for lethal knowledge.
And the flip side is also true. Happiness and virtue are no arguments for truth.
Exactly. The modern tendency to equate truth with beneficial, comfortable consequences, that's just another form of dogmatism, a moralistic avoidance of harsh reality.
He talks about this temptation to assume a deceptive principle in the essence of things.
But if we hold our own thinking, our spirit, responsible for the world's falseness, he says that's just an honorable detour taken by every conscious or unconscious advocatus Dei.
An advocate of God.
In other words, we have to stop blaming the world for not conforming to our moral needs. We have to accept the possibility that the nature of reality and the deepest truth we uncover might be lethal to the comforting illusions that are necessary for mass survival.
And that is the courage required of the philosopher of the dangerous trolley, perhaps.
This philosophical courage, this willingness to face potentially destructive truths, brings us right to his intense analysis of religion.
Right, not as divine revelation, but as a psychological and cultural phenomenon.
And the crisis of theism is immediate in the source. In section 53, he just lists the causes of modern European atheism.
The theological concepts of father, judge, rewarder, and free will in God are, thoroughly refuted by modern science and historical critique.
Yes, but the truly scathing critique isn't the lack of proof, it's the theological concept itself. The worst fault of the Christian God.
He seems unable to communicate clearly.
Exactly. If God is all-loving and all-knowing, why is his message so complex, so ambiguous, and subject to such brutal, contradictory interpretation over centuries? Is he just unclear?
It implies either intellectual incompetence or maybe a lack of a will that's powerful enough to enforce its own clarity.
Right. But this atheism, he notes, is paradoxical, because while theistic satisfaction is rejected, the religious instinct itself is actually growing powerfully.
So it's a redirecting of profound spiritual energy, not its elimination.
That's it. The instinct for deep reverence, for self-overcoming that's still there, it just looks at the old idea of God with deep mistrust.
And this philosophical redirecting is crucial. In section 54, he sees the entire modern philosophical project since Descartes as an attack on the old soul concept, a Seelenbegriff.
Because philosophers, by seeking to tear down dogma, have been unconsciously making an anti-Christian critique. The entire Christian morality rests on the assumption of a metaphysical, fixed soul.
The analysis then takes a very dark, famous turn into the history of religious cruelty.
Section 55, a terrifying ladder of stages that reveals man's deep-seated need for ritualized suffering.
There are three critical steps on this ladder. First, the most primitive, the sacrifice of men to God.
Ancient practices, the sacrifice of firstlings, the human being offering up something external and valuable to appease a deity.
And second, in the moral epoch, the cruelty turns inward.
This is the sacrifice of the strongest instincts and nature to God. This is the ascetic period, the self-denial, the spiritual flagellation, the purposeful negation of one's earthly drives in favor of an abstract ideal.
And the third and last great sacrifice, what is it?
This one is reserved for the strongest free spirits, the philosophers of the future. It's the sacrifice of all consolation, all hope, all healing, and finally, God himself.
Why is sacrificing God the highest act of cruelty?
Because it's the ultimate expression of the will's strength. It means denying yourself the last great metaphysical comfort, the idea of a loving father or a judge or an ultimate meaning. To destroy the very foundation of meaning and still affirm existence. That is the profound self-cruelty required of the strongest will.
That's a profound paradox, especially when you think about that ascetic phase. Why did the mightiest, most life-affirming men, like military rulers, still revere the saint or the ascetic, even though they looked weak and pathetic?
Because they sensed the superior strength of will, the Willzermacht, hidden behind that denial. They recognized that such a massive denial, an ungeheuers von Verneinung of nature, such severe self-discipline, must have a profound, even dangerous reason.
So the powerful honored a quality in themselves when they honored the saint.
Strength of will and the capacity for long-term self-mastery.
Yes. And this insight connects religion directly to the project of the future philosopher. Religion is a breeding and educational tool. A Züchtungs- und Erziehungszweck.
Exactly. In the hands of the new commanding caste, religion has a precise dual function. For the commanding or the strong, it serves as a method of training in self-overcoming asceticism, puritanism, silence, solitude.
These practices secure obedience, discipline, and fitness to rule.
They act as a means to overcome your own internal resistance and achieve a unified, powerful command over yourself.
And what about the vast majority? The serving class, the mediocre, the weaker wills who need structure.
For them, religion provides unschätzbare Genügsamkeit, invaluable contentment with their difficult lot in life. It refines their obedience, it makes their lowliness tolerable, and it beautifies their healthier Armuth.
Their half-animal poverty.
It lays sunshine on these continually vexed people, making their existence tolerable, predictable, and even glorious in the eyes of God.
But Section 62 provides the heavy consequence of this utilitarian view.
It does.
Christianity and Buddhism are described as religions for the suffering, Religionen für Leidende. By taking the side of the sick and the suffering and upholding those who ought to perish, these religions work for the Verschlechterung.
The deterioration of the European race. They systematically cast suspicion on everything self-reliant, male, conquering, and ambitious, the very instincts necessary for the highest and most successful human types to flourish.
The tragic irony, then, is that the immense debt of gratitude we owe Christianity for its compassion actually contributes in the overall accounting of human value to the lowering of the human type.
It promotes the slave ideal. That's his final judgment on it.
Shifting from the moral sphere to the cultural, Nietzsche offers this blistering psychological analysis of Europe's national characteristics.
He does. He's looking for the raw material, or maybe the obstacles, for his future philosophical project.
And his critique of the German soul is particularly complex and, I think, self-aware.
It is. He starts by deflating the common idea of German depth. He says the German soul is not a simple two souls in the breast, like Goethe's Faust. It's a bewildering, unbuilt mix of Races ungeheuerlichsten Mischung.
Pieced together from all these conflicting origins.
Yes, so their famous depth isn't necessarily wisdom or brilliance.
What is it then?
The source suggests it might be something worse than thought, a slow, ponderous, almost swampy psychological state. And the successful, pragmatic German type of the 19th century is actively trying to lose this depth.
They're seeking Schneidigkeit.
Sharpness, swiftness, decisiveness, all qualities that are the opposite of that kind of depth.
And this cultural mishmash is reflected directly in their aesthetic taste, especially their prose.
Oh, yes. Section 246 is a direct attack on German style. German books are a torment to the reader with a third ear.
The prose is a slow, soundless swamp of rhythms without dance. Hard, heavy, ceremoniously clumsy.
And this clumsiness is a manifestation of that underlying psychological conflict. When they try to write, it lacks the spontaneous, powerful rhythm of a unified, self-mastered soul. It's a style that betrays their lack of inner cohesion.
And this even extends to their greatest art form, music.
He says the most fundamental danger for German music, like Schumann's emotional complexity and heavy sentimentality, is that it will lose the voice of the European soul-like, the clarity and precision of Mozart, and just descend to mere patriotism. Vaterländerei.
But it's not all negative. You see the contrast when Napoleon encounters Goethe.
A fantastic moment. The source says we have to understand Napoleon's astonishment deeply. Wanda onum, that is a man, and I only expected a German.
It reveals the century-long expectation that the German spirit was just soft and poetic.
A tender, good-hearted, weak-willed, and poetic simpleton. A reputation Goethe himself had to overcome by sheer force of will and intellect.
Then moving beyond the Germans, the English get an even harsher judgment.
They do. The source labels them a fundamentally unphilosophical race.
Their mediocrity is deep and widespread, causing a total depression of the European spirit.
And he says they rely heavily on Christianity, not for spiritual ascent, but purely for moral discipline and regulating the masses. He singles out the English utilitarians, Darwin, Mill, Spencer, as industrious, mediocre, and uninspired.
Right, in a few sections he argues that the utilitarians, by valuing everything as useful, are only serving as the cart horse for their own deep-seated, mediocre inclinations.
He claims the typical Englishman lacks music and dance in the movements of his soul and body, which makes his attempts at philosophy clumsy and focused on low-level comfort.
Then we move to the Jews, where the critique becomes highly complex. He acknowledges both immense achievement and what he sees as a geopolitical threat.
Yes, he asks what Europe owes them, and he credits them with the great style and morality den Grossens still endure moral, the terror and majesty of infinite demands, the power to make man feel small against a universal law.
And he celebrates their resilience.
He does. He calls them the strongest, toughest, and purest race in Europe, enduring difficult conditions better than favorable ones, thanks to this resolute, enduring faith that isn't ashamed of modern ideas.
This combination of ancient strength and modern adaptability makes them a force.
It does, but he says the current European instinct, which fears its own dissolution and lack of unity, mandates no new Jews let in.
And he frames this not as a moral judgment, but as the instinct of a populace that's still weak and undetermined.
Right. They fear being culturally overwhelmed by a stronger, tougher, more organized race. It's the leveling instinct fearing a sudden injection of high-powered will.
So finally, what does this cultural diagnosis mean for the future of Europe?
Well, Section 242 states that the democratic movement is a huge physiological process leading to the Einheitlichung, the leveling and equalization of all Europeans. Borders are dissolving, national characters becoming homogenized.
The time for petty politics, Kleinstaaterei, is over.
But this democratic leveling is seen as a dangerous weakness when you look at it geopolitically. And the counter-necessity is revealed in Section 209, with the growing threat of Russia, which he describes as the strongest willpower in Europe, accumulating strength.
Europe needs to resolve its fragmented state and acquire one will, einen Willen zu bekommen.
Through a new ruling caste. This unified caste must be capable of setting long, terrifying goals spanning millennia. They have to act as the breeder and commander of Europe.
This is the coming struggle for Erdherrschaft, Earth Lordship, and the compulsion to great politics.
And the philosopher of the future has to be the intellectual foundation and perhaps the spiritual general for this grand geopolitical breeding project.
So we have to address the definition of the new standard that justifies this whole colossal project. What is noble?
Yes, the entire revaluation of beyond good and evil hinges on distinguishing the noble from the base.
And Nietzsche asserts in section 257 that every elevation of the type man has always been the work of an aristocratic society.
Right. Such a society fundamentally believes in a long ladder of rank and value differences, and, crucially, that slavery or subservience is necessary in some sense for it to exist.
And the core concept that arises from this belief in profound difference is the pathos du distance.
The pathos of distance. This is the chronic, fundamental, celebratory sense of difference between the superior and the inferior. It comes from the contrast between the ruling, commanding caste and the serving class. It's the feeling of being fundamentally separate and higher in value.
And how does this manifest in the character of the noble man? Section 265 talks about his egoism.
But it's not simple selfish whim or calculating self-interest like the utilitarians practice. He says it's a matter of heavenly mechanics and justice. The noble man acts out of an Überfluss von Macht.
An overflowing power.
Not out of pity or calculation or need. This overflowing power means the noble person naturally gives and honors and values, but they do it from a position of surplus, not deficiency. They're confident their high value is inherent.
And they only treat others as equals when they recognize the potential for similar greatness.
Precisely. Which leads directly to that famous contrast that defines the psychological landscape.
Yeah.
The slave moral versus the master moral.
Okay, let's break that down.
The master moral is intolerant, and it requires the breeding of strong, simple traits. It's based on self-affirmation. It defines good as noble, strong, powerful, and successful. And it defines bad as contemptible, cowardly, anxious, fearful, lying.
It expresses a feeling of fullness, power, and wealth that wants to give and bestow value on the world.
Exactly. Now, in contrast, the slave moral is born from the repressed and the resentful. It's a morality of reaction.
So it defines evil both as precisely those characteristics the masters possess.
The powerful, the dangerous, the terrible. The slave moral expresses a pessimistic suspicion against the human condition. It values the good man as the harmless, undangerous gentleman.
Who is inevitably weak and dependent.
Yes. And crucially, the slave moral has to hide its true motivations, its resentment and weakness, behind abstract concepts like equality and justice.
Section 217 argues that the moralistic pedant who's constantly preaching equality deserves to be laughed at.
Because they're just trying to drag everyone else down to their level out of fear.
The noble soul, on the other hand, operating from a place of necessary natural hierarchy, understands that its egoism, which is based on the law of things and overflowing strength, is what makes it superior.
Right. And the ultimate sign of high rank, according to Section 287, is that the noble soul possesses Ehrfurcht vor sich.
Reverence for itself.
Which is not vanity. It's an acknowledgement of the tremendous self-overcoming and breeding that went into becoming that type of man. It's the ultimate affirmation of one's own created value.
This aristocratic quality of the noble soul brings us back to the philosopher, who, being so far above the common herd, has to embrace concealment.
Yes, Section 40, the famous line, Alles was tiefest liebt die Mask, everything deep loves the mask.
The deep man is cautious with his shame, his vulnerability is his deepest thoughts.
Because they're too valuable and too complex to be subjected to the leveling judgment of the masses. He says there's much goodness gut in this cunning. In rolling through life rough and round like an old green, heavily armored wine cask, as he puts it.
All to protect something precious and delicate inside, the potential for great creation.
Yes, and this necessary concealment leads to the new, dangerous name for the philosopher of the future, the experimenters, Versucher.
Their very nature is to remain a wrathsel, a whittle, to avoid being mistaken for mere nivelier or levelers.
Or free spirits who are just slaves of democratic taste.
That distinction between the passive free spirit and the active philosopher of the future seems absolutely vital.
It is. The free spirit is the necessary preparatory stage. A person who roams through and critiques the existing values of the world. They're fundamentally reactive. But the true philosopher's task is something else entirely.
Creation.
Creation. They are not critics. They are not academic workers who are just synthesizing previous values like the followers of Kant or Hegel. They don't just know what is.
Yeah.
Sections 211 and 213 emphasize the ultimate task. The true philosophers are commanding and lawgivers. Befehlende und Gesetzgeber.
They don't just know. Their knowing is creating Schaffen, and their creation is legislation, Gesetzgebung.
They set the values.
And their will to truth is the will to power. They determine the whither and whereto of mankind, using the entirety of the past philosophical labor as their raw material, their tool, their hammer.
They are, in the most profound sense, the breeders of man, determining what the human type will become over the next millennia.
Which demands enormous responsibility, high-minded glances, the art of commanding.
And the vastness of the will, which is why they must wear the mask. They're acting as surgeons and architects of the future.
Well, this deep dive has been a challenging, exhilarating tour through the sources, forcing us to abandon our comfortable moral and metaphysical assumptions.
It's a lot to take in.
We've seen Nietzsche reject traditional dogmatism, exposing it as built on simple superstitions like the Seelen Aberglaube and the Platonic devaluation of the earth.
And we learned that every great philosophy is fundamentally a self-confession, an involuntary memoir of the philosopher's deepest instincts and will, and that the idea of pure, disinterested reason is, well, it's a myth.
The ultimate driver of the world and of interpretation is the absolute and terrifying will to power.
We tracked the evolution of moral valuation from consequences to intentions, only to realize that modern altruism is a deeply interesting and self-interested drive, and that intellectual health depends on cheerful mistrust, not unconditional certainty.
Especially regarding truths that might be lethal.
Especially then.
And finally, we covered the strategic, utilitarian function of religion as a tool for breeding or comforting different ranks of men, and explored the characteristics of the master morality rooted in the pathos of distance.
And a noble soul's reverence for itself is the highest goal.
The ultimate figure Nietzsche envisions is the creative lawgiver, the experimenter, the one who knows how to conceal his depth beneath a mask while commanding mankind toward a new, terrifyingly long-term goal.
And this final vision, outlined in the concluding poem, the Nachtgesang, leaves us with a provocative image of what this transformation requires of the philosopher. It is a painful, self-inflicted process.
The source speaks of the philosopher as a wrestler who too often conquered himself, too often braced himself against his own strength, wounded and hampered by his own victory.
Ein Ringer, der zu auf sich selbst bezwungen, durch eigenen Sieg verwundet und gehemmt. That imagery suggests that the greatest struggle is internal. These are relentless, self-inflicted wounds required for the philosopher to become that new, stronger type of man.
So the victory comes at the cost of being wounded and hampered by the very triumph over one's previous self, perpetually sacrificing the old values.
It does. And this leads to our final question for you, the learner, which we take from section 287. What does noble mean to you today?
The noble soul, according to Nietzsche, possesses Ehrfurcht for the reverence for itself. But in a modern world that is constantly striving for universal utility, for democratic leveling, and for easy accessibility, where does the modern person find any room for that kind of high self-regard, this aristocratic preparation of the spirit, without just being dismissed as vain or out of touch?
The highest problems, the source warns, repel anyone who dares approach without being bred gesuchte, signed for their solution by the power of their spirit. This implies that intellectual depth isn't merely earned through hard work. It requires an almost aristocratic preparation and an inherited capacity for strength of will.
Which challenges the fundamental democratic premise that all ideas are equally accessible to all people.
A profound challenge to an age that values quick, accessible knowledge above all else.
Definitely food for thought as you venture back, armed with new understanding, beyond good and evil.